The Everyday Life of Abraham Lincoln, by Francis Fisher Browne. Chapter 25a. The battle summer of 1863, a turn of the tide, Lee's invasion of Pennsylvania, a threatening crisis, change of Union commanders, Meade succeeds Hooker, the battle of Gettysburg, Lincoln's anxiety during the fight, the retreat of Lee, Union victories in the Southwest, the capture of Vicksburg, Lincoln's thanks to Grant. Midsummer of 1863 brought a turn in the tide of military affairs. It came none too soon for the safety of the nation. The repeated reverses to the Union arms, ending with the shocking disasters at Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville, although slightly relieved by the costly success of Stone River, had seemed to throw the chances of war in favor of the South, and the Union cause was at the crisis of its fate. But now fortune smiled upon the North, and its lost hope and lost ground were regained at Gettysburg and Vicksburg. These great battles are justly regarded as marking the turning point of the war. It was yet far from finished. There remained nearly 2 years of desperate fighting, with heroic struggles and terrible sacrifices of life, before the end should come. But from this time the character of the struggle seemed to change. The armies of the South fought, not less desperately, but more on the defensive, and their final overthrow was in all human probability chiefly a question of time. Emboldened by his success at Chancellorsville in May, General Lee again assumed the offensive, and recrossed the Potomac River into Maryland. Late in June he invaded Pennsylvania and occupied a position threatening Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Washington. The situation was most critical. If Lee could once more beat the Army of the Potomac, as he had done so many times, these three great cities, and even New York, might be at his mercy. The feeling in Washington is reflected in entreaties made at the time in Mr. Welles's diary. "Something of a panic pervades the city," says Mr. Welles. "Singular rumors reach us of rebel advances into Maryland. It is said they have reached Hagerstown, and some of them have penetrated as far as Chambersburg in Pennsylvania. The city is full of strange, wild rumors of rebel raids in the vicinity and of trains seized in sight of the capital. The War Department is wholly unprepared for an irruption here, and J.E.B. Stuart might have dashed into the city to-day, June 28th, with impunity. I have a panic telegraph from Governor Curtin of Pennsylvania, who is excitable and easily alarmed, entreating that guns and gunners may be sent from the Navy Yard at Philadelphia to Harrisburg without delay. I went again at a late hour to the War Department, but could get no facts or intelligence from the Secretary. All was vague, opaque, thick darkness. I really think Stanton is no better posted than myself, and from what Stanton says am afraid Hooker does not comprehend Lee's intentions nor know how to counteract them. It looks to me as if Lee was putting forth his whole energy and force in one great and desperate struggle which shall be decisive." Following Lee, the Army of the Potomac, under General Hooker, also recrossed the Potomac, and pursued the enemy by a somewhat parallel route, but keeping carefully between him and Washington. The occasion was one calling for the best resources of a great military commander, and General Hooker, realizing his unfitness for the responsibility, asked to be relieved of the command. Thus was thrown upon the President the hazardous necessity of changing commanders upon the very eve of a great battle. It was a terrible emergency. Even the stout-hearted Stanton was appalled. He afterwards stated that when he received the dispatch from Hooker asking to be relieved, his heart sank within him, and he was more depressed than at any other moment of the war. "I could not say," said Mr. Stanton, "that any other officer knew General Hooker's plans, or the position even of the various divisions of the army. I sent for the President to come at once to the War Office. It was in the evening, but the President soon appeared. I handed him the dispatch. As he read it, his face became like lead, and I said, 'What shall be done?' He replied instantly, 'Accept his resignation.'" Immediately an order was sent to Major General George G. Meade, one of the most efficient of the corps commanders of the Army of the Potomac, appointing him to the chief command. Meade was a quiet, unassuming man, very unlike Hooker. 3 days after assuming command, he led his army against the Southern host at Gettysburg, where, after a most bloody and memorable battle of 3 days' duration (July 1st, 2d, and 3d, 1863), was won the first decisive victory in the history of the gallant Army of the Potomac. Lee retired with disastrous losses across the Potomac to Virginia, and Washington and the North breathed free again. Senator Chandler of Michigan, speaking of the terrible strain on Lincoln during the progress of the Battle of Gettysburg, said, "I shall never forget the painful anxiety of those few days when the fate of the nation seemed to hang in the balance, nor the restless solicitude of Mr. Lincoln as he paced up and down the room, reading dispatches, soliloquizing, and often stopping to trace the position of the contending armies on the map which hung on the wall, nor the relief we all felt when the fact was established that victory, though gained at such fearful cost, was indeed on the side of the Union." Amidst the murk and gloom of those dark days in Washington, when the suspense was breathless and the heart of the nation responded in muffled beats to the dull booming of the cannon of Meade and Lee at Gettysburg, an episode occurred, with Lincoln as the central figure, which reveals perhaps more poignantly than any other in his whole career the depths of feeling in that tender and reverential soul. On Sunday evening, July 4th, the 4th day of that terrible battle, with nothing definite yet known of the result, the President drove out in a carriage, in company with 2 daughters of Secretary Stanton, to the line of defenses near Arlington. It was toward sundown, and a brigade of troops were forming in position for an evening parade or review. The commander of the brigade, General Tannatt, recognizing the President and his party, rode up to the carriage and invited them to witness the parade. The President assented. His face was drawn and haggard in its expression of anxiety and sorrow. As it was Sunday evening, some of the regimental bands played familiar religious pieces. The President, hearing them, inquired of General Tannatt if any of his bands could play "Lead, Kindly Light." Then, in a low voice and with touching accents, he repeated, as if to himself, the familiar lines, never more expressive or appropriate than now: "Lead, kindly light, amid the encircling gloom, lead thou me on. Keep thou my feet, I do not ask to see the distant scene, one step enough for me." As the sweet strains of the familiar hymn floated on the evening air, Lincoln's sad face became sadder still, and tears were seen coursing down his cheeks. What emotions were his, who can tell, as he thought of that great battlefield not far away, its issues yet unknown, its ground still covered with dead and wounded soldiers whose heroic deeds, to use his noble words spoken a few months later on that historic field, have consecrated it far above our power to add or detract. General Tannatt, who knew Lincoln well and had spoken with him many times, never saw him again, and his view of that tragic, tear-wet face remains to him a vivid and precious memory. Footnote: General T.R. Tannatt, a graduate of West Point in 1858, is now (1913) an active and honored citizen of Spokane, Washington. End footnote. While the eyes of the nation were fastened upon the great drama being enacted near the capital, events scarcely less momentous were occurring in the Southwest. The campaign against Vicksburg, the great Confederate stronghold on the Mississippi River, had been in active progress under the personal command of General Grant for several months. The importance of this strategic point was fully understood by the enemy, and it was defended most stubbornly. At first Grant's plans proved unsuccessful. The cutting of canals and opening of bayous failed, as President Lincoln had expected and predicted. But these failures only served to develop the unsuspected energy of Grant's character and the extent of his military resources. He boldly changed his entire plan of operations, abandoned his line of communication, removed his army to a point below Vicksburg, and attacked the city in the rear. With dogged persistence he pressed forward, gaining point by point, beating off General Johnston's forces on one side and driving Pemberton before him into Vicksburg, until finally, by the aid of Admiral Porter's gunboats on the Mississippi, he had entirely invested the city. Gradually and persistently his lines closed in, pushed forward by assault and siege, until Vicksburg accepted its doom, and on the 4th of July, 1863, the day of Lee's retreat from Gettysburg, the city and garrison surrendered to the victorious Grant. Lincoln's exuberant joy over the capture of Vicksburg is revealed in an entry made at the time in Mr. Welles's diary. "I was handed a dispatch from Admiral Porter communicating the fall of Vicksburg on the 4th of July," says Mr. Welles. "I immediately returned to the Executive Mansion. The President was detailing certain points relative to Grant's movements on the map to Chase and 2 or 3 others, when I gave him the tidings. Putting down the map, he rose at once, said he would drop these topics, and added, 'I myself will telegraph this news to General Meade.' He seized his hat, but suddenly stopped, his countenance beaming with joy. He caught my hand, and throwing his arm around me, exclaimed, 'What can we do for the Secretary of the Navy for this glorious intelligence? He is always giving us good news. I cannot in words tell you my joy over this result. It is great, Mr. Welles, it is great.' We walked the lawn together. 'This,' said he, 'will relieve Banks. It will inspire me.'" The Union victories at Vicksburg and Gettysburg caused great rejoicing at the North, and gave added zest to the celebration of the national patriotic holiday. President Lincoln, mindful of the almost inestimable services, as he termed them, of General Grant, and as it was his wont to do in such circumstances, made haste to acknowledge his own and the country's indebtedness to the man who had accomplished a great deed. He addressed to the conqueror of Vicksburg the following letter: "Executive Mansion, Washington, D.C., July 13, 1863. "Major General Grant, my dear General, I do not remember that you and I ever met personally. I write this now as a grateful acknowledgment for the almost inestimable services you have done the country. I write to say a word further. When you first reached the vicinity of Vicksburg, I thought you should do what you finally did: march the troops across the neck, run the batteries with the transports, and thus go below. And I never had any faith, except a general hope that you knew better than I, that the Yazoo Pass expedition, and the like, could succeed. When you got below and took Port Gibson, Grand Gulf, and vicinity, I thought you should go down the river and join General Banks, and when you turned northward, east of the Big Black, I feared it was a mistake. I now wish to make the personal acknowledgment that you were right and I was wrong. Yours truly, A. Lincoln." An officer who was the first from Grant's army to reach Washington after the surrender of Vicksburg has recorded the circumstances of his interview with the President. "Mr. Lincoln received me very cordially," says this officer, "and drawing a chair near to himself and motioning me to be seated, said, 'Now I want to hear all about Vicksburg.' I gave him all the information I could, though he appeared to be remarkably well posted himself. He put to me a great many questions in detail touching the siege, the losses, the morale of the army, its sanitary condition, the hospital service, and General Grant. Said he, 'I guess I was right in standing by Grant, although there was great pressure made after Pittsburgh landing to have him removed. I thought I saw enough in Grant to convince me that he was one on whom the country could depend. That unconditional surrender message to Buckner at Donelson suited me. It indicated the spirit of the man.'" It is interesting to note that before the capture of Vicksburg the protracted campaign had occasioned so little dissatisfaction with General Grant. The President had been importuned to remove him, and had much formidable opposition to encounter in his determination to stand by him. Only a few days before the capitulation of the beleaguered city, Senator Wade of Ohio, Bluff Ben Wade, as he was termed, called upon the President and urged Grant's dismissal; to which Lincoln good-naturedly replied, "Senator, that reminds me of a story." "Yes, yes," rejoined Wade petulantly, "that is the way it is with you, sir, all story, story. You are the father of every military blunder that has been made during the war. You are on your road to hell, sir, with this Government, and you are not a mile off this minute." Lincoln calmly retorted, "Senator, that is just about the distance from here to the Capitol, is it not?" The exasperated Wade grabbed his hat and rushed angrily from the White House. It is not pleasant to record that the cordial and generous congratulations to Grant for his achievements at Vicksburg were in marked contrast to the rather grudging recognition of Meade's much more important and hard-won victory at Gettysburg. In the latter case, the dispatches from Washington took the form not so much of acknowledgments of what had been done as of complaints at what had not been done. It is hard to believe that the President dictated, or even authorized, the ill-timed and peevish dispatch sent to General Meade. Footnote: the criticism of Meade for not attacking Lee before he recrossed the Potomac is based on the assumption that the attack must be successful. On this point, Meade's words to Halleck, written in reply to the latter's conciliatory letter of July 28th, can hardly be ignored. Had I attacked Lee the day I proposed to do so, and in the ignorance that then existed of his position, I have every reason to believe the attack would have been unsuccessful, and would have resulted disastrously. This opinion is founded on the judgment of a number of distinguished officers after inspecting Lee's vacated works and position. Among these officers I could name Generals Sedgwick, Wright, Slocum, Hayes, Sykes, and others. In other words, the attack which Meade has been so severely blamed for not making might have ended in reversing the results at Gettysburg, losing all we had gained at such terrible cost, placed Washington and other Northern cities in far more deadly peril, and changing the whole subsequent issues of the war. By the inopportune Halleck, a few days after the battle of Gettysburg, in which the victor on that desperate field is officially informed that the escape of Lee's army has created great dissatisfaction in the mind of the President, and it will require an active and energetic pursuit to remove the impression that it has not been sufficiently active before. To this extraordinary message Meade at once made a simple and manly rejoinder, in which he said, "Having performed my duty conscientiously and to the best of my ability, the censure of the President, as conveyed in your dispatch, is in my judgment so undeserved that I feel compelled most respectfully to ask to be immediately relieved from the command of this army." Halleck replied rather ineptly that his dispatch had not been intended as a censure, but as a stimulus, and was not regarded as a sufficient cause for Meade's request to be relieved. When one thinks of the ill fortunes of the Army of the Potomac under previous commanders, and of the unlikelihood of finding a successor to Meade as capable as he had shown himself to be, one shudders at the chances of what might have happened had another change of leaders been forced upon that long-suffering and now victorious army. General Meade did not press his resignation after Halleck's conciliatory telegrams, and remained in immediate command of the Army of the Potomac until the close of the war, Grant's accession to the chief command of all the armies having marked the end of the well-meant but often ill-advised and troublesome interference with military affairs from Washington.